For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services. For the purposes of this content, best shall be defined as most preferred by Peter Franson when compared to a limited sample of alternatives. Hey guys, Peter Franson here from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions, here to present to you my picks for the best movies that you probably missed during 2020. 2020 was a crazy year, as we know, and one thing that was different about it was the way movies were released, or the fact that many of them weren't, or many of them were delayed, and their marketing campaigns were off, and so a number of movies that maybe you would kind of have heard something about at some point completely went off the radar. And some movies that wouldn't have been bubbling to the surface, but you might have run into anyway, fell even further to the wayside of the viewer's eye. And so at the end of 2020, looking back at the movies I'd seen and reviewed, I was like, I know I missed some. I know I missed some gems out there, and so I wanted to take some extra time and kind of catch up, scour around, and find those movies that I might have caught during 2020 if it had been a normal year, and watch them, give them a chance, so that I could have a fuller crop to represent 2020 as I present my list of just what were the most enjoyable movies for me. And as is tradition, I am going to start with my legacy movie of the year, my legacy movie of 2020. This is a movie that did not technically release in 2020, although I would say most people, it had such a limited release in 2019, most people did not see it in 2019. If you did see it or hear about it, it was probably during 2020 at some point, maybe particularly at the beginning. But the movie that I most enjoyed during 2020 that did not release in 2020 was Color Out of Space, starring Nicolas Cage. This is based on a Lovecraft story, an H.P. Lovecraft story, and Nicolas Cage can be really hit or miss with me. It depends on how he's cast, because if you point his energy in the right direction and the right kind of role, he can be a great fit. But if you point it in a different place, in a different type of role, it can feel very, very off. And in this case, he was a wonderful choice for me, both as a warm father to this family that's undergoing strange things in this house in the woods that they have come to own and are trying to make a new life at. And he also wonderfully gets unhinged, as the rest of the family all does, as things continue to get weirder and weirder as the story progresses. So both Nicolas Cage and the cast as a whole, I thought, was really well cast, and also each individual actor delivered great performances that matched what I think the script asked of them and provided more things in addition to that. It's all about, as Lovecraft is so often, about the things that are disturbing and the fear of the unknown, and there's crazy, nasty body horror, which I really connect with and really am unsettled by. It has wonderful practical effects and uses digital effects in a way that is conservative and appropriate, doesn't lean on them too heavily. It has grounded family relational drama that starts out as really like the core of where all the tension comes from, is seeing this family that does love each other, even though they rub each other the wrong way, as all family members do at some point, and often very frequently. But you see the love undergirding that they have for each other, and you see the tragedy of what happens to this family that I think that they do give time investing in you caring about at the front of the movie. You see and feel, I think, at least I did, the tension and the tragedy of what happens to them because of how they invested in these family relationships and the very real kinds of family tensions and drama that many people experience. It also starts at that kind of place, but then builds to this increasingly weirder, wilder sci-fi place where it just is unleashed in terms of its sci-fi horror-ness. So, really satisfying. I mean, On another year, I would have just roped this in and made this my, my movie of 2020. That's how much I really enjoyed it. But I thought, okay, well, this time I make the rules a little bit, I guess, every year that I do this. And so this year I'll say it's my legacy movie. But on another year, oh man, I would have just said, who cares? Most people didn't see it in 2019. This is my movie of 2020. It was just a really gripping and powerful experience that I quickly added to my movie collection. All right, so my number 5 of the movies that actually did come out in 2020 that I really enjoyed, Shadow in the Cloud. This one stars Chloe Grace Moretz. I just reviewed it very recently. It takes place in World War II about this woman who is trying basically to get from A to B in a military context, but the other people in the military around her have no respect for her, which is predictable for that time period. But she is also the only person that notices there's some kind of creature on board the plane as they are traveling, and she's down in the gunner station, secluded from the rest of the crew, and so they're just making fun of her and not seeing what she is seeing, and it just builds from there, and things get crazy and wild and all kinds of sci-fi horror type of stuff. But it's also very character-driven, and that maybe is a theme of movies that tend to connect with me, is that they are character-driven or character-focused at the very least. And there's a very tight focus on Chloe Grace Moretz's character and her performance, which I think carries the movie really well. She is vulnerable in a way that male heroes, male protagonists in this kind of movie are usually not allowed to be, at least not to this extent. But despite being vulnerable, she also pushes through the physical and emotional distress that she is under during this movie, making her character all that more empathetic, or I can empathize with her character more. I can connect with her character more. So I really appreciate leading characters in action and suspense movies that are permitted to be vulnerable. And there's also a pseudo-realistic psychology and emotions that are represented in this movie. Some very relatable kind of human desires and motives that are driving her, yet it's in this really wild sci-fi type of context when you have this creature involved. And I really enjoy that kind of juxtapositioning of real human drama and pseudo-realistic psychology with wild circumstances, So my number 5, Shadow in the Cloud. Number 4 on my list, Monsters of Man. This one you probably didn't see anything about unless you stumbled onto it by mistake. Also one that I reviewed early this year in 2021. And it's basically about military robots gone wrong. There's a technology company that has a contract with the military, and the military is basically testing these robots in a black ops mission type of scenario, and it goes wrong. The robots start attacking innocent civilians, and there are children that are dying at the same time. These robots are treated as very cold, the very cold, heartless machines that they are, and I appreciate that in a movie that explores AI as this one does. It's generally a tense, on-the-run type of story as these civilians, led by an off-duty special ops military guy, are being chased for most of the movie by these robots that are tailing them, tracking them, and picking them off one by one. There's a heavy intensity about it, even though the performances for some of the cast I think were a little bit weak, not playing to their strengths in the first 30 minutes, but after that I was just really engaged with the movie the entire time. There are multiple interesting players in this story with different motives that are interplaying with each other, and it's interesting to keep track of all of them and the different situations that they're in. So even as the dialogue and the acting sometimes fall short for me, it's made up for by those other elements of situational tension and the different motives of the different players that are involved in the story. And I also thought that the direction was really strong. I want to see more by this director. I think it's their first film, but I was just gripped by the presentation of this movie, pretty much, well, not from beginning to end, but right about 30 minutes in toward the end, from that point to the end, certainly. And on top of all that, for an indie movie like this, I'm surprised and pleased to report that these are the most realistic looking and moving robots I've ever seen in a movie. So really a nice little hidden gem, Monsters of Man. My number three for 2020 is the animated movie Justice League Dark Apocalypse War. And this is the final of the DC animated movies that began sharing continuity based roughly on the New 52 relaunch of DC Comics from a number of years ago. And this one, I mean, I'm already invested in the DC universe. That's my comic book universe of choice. And so I love these characters. I'm invested in these characters, even though I didn't like much of what was done with that universe with the New 52. I'm still invested more than I would be in other animated movies, you know, when it comes to DC. And this one also had brutal action, the likes of which is rarely allowed in the animated movies leading up to this, and certainly never seen with this much frequency and concentration as it is in this movie. And it also had some heavy dramatic moments. Certainly, yes, that's aided by my investment in the DC characters, but nevertheless, it was able to bring me nearly to tears at a few different spots in this movie, and that's a very rare thing in an animated movie, and so really appreciated that. And the stakes are massive. There are things that happen to this world and to the status quo of the animated DC universe that are more widespread, more devastating than the Infinity War story of the live-action Marvel movies and Endgame. I mean, you think about what happened in those and how devastating that was and what a loss the heroes suffered, and I would say that is almost nothing compared to the devastation that the heroes face in Justice League Dark Apocalypse War. And it's not to say that there isn't a victory of sorts at the end, but it is not a complete victory. It is not a nice bow tied on everything and everything reset and it's all just wonderful and, you know, there's no loss. There is tremendous loss at the end of this story, and yeah, I just appreciate them having the freedom, being given the freedom by whoever greenlit this, to go to these heavy and dark places, despite the fact that it's an animated series. And speaking of the animation, it's the quality I've come to expect for many years now with these DC animated movies, both in terms of animation and in voice acting. And so altogether, a great package that went to some places that the animated movies for DC have not quite gone before, that I was really satisfied to see happening in Justice League Dark Apocalypse War. My number two is, well, this is kind of a cheat. It released in 2018 originally, but not in the U.S. It had a Canadian and maybe a European release prior to 2020, but it had a U.S. release of 2020, and that's why it comes into this point in my list. Otherwise, maybe I would have made it my legacy movie and put Color Out of Space in here. I don't know. Anyway, the movie is Parallel, and this is about a group of young 20-somethings that discover a portal to alternate parallel realities, parallel universes. And unlike so many stories of this type that would say, oh, in this world everyone's evil, in this world everyone's hair is purple, there's some weird striking thing that's different about, you know, everything in this other world, this parallel reality story is more about playing with the idea of other realities that are very, very similar to our own. And how could we, if we have the ability to travel to those worlds and back, how could we leverage that to affect our lives here in this world? It's not about exploring all these worlds and doing adventures in these other realities like so many other stories of this type are. No, it's about how can we go to those worlds and then come back and in some way leverage that experience to make our lives here better. And so it's very interesting to see just a different application of this classic sci-fi trope. It goes from a light, fun tone with these characters discovering what they can do and what's fun about this whole experience, to the ramifications really playing out into something that's a much heavier and darker kind of drama. It's very character-focused. I don't want to quite say character-driven, but there's a lot of focus given to the characters in this story that I really appreciate. And the acting is solid and fitting. It's unknown faces to me. And I don't want to say like, oh my gosh, these are some amazing performances, but very solid and fitting. And I appreciate that almost as much as actors that are really striking and, you know, and stand out from the Hollywood Hollywood crowd, for their ability on its own. So I'd be interested in seeing all these actors in more stuff, because I really felt like they did a great job in this movie. The visual effects were conservative and effective. I mean, it's playing with constantly these wild sci-fi ideas, and yet I didn't miss the lack of, effects being plastered and splattered all over the place. I felt like the visual effects, when they were used, were they serviced the story. They were not distracting, either because they were too busy, or because they were too poor. I wouldn't say that they were great. Sometimes they did appear to fall short a little bit, but they got in and got out, and I did not feel like the story was lacking anything for the fact that it had fewer visual effects than you might see in another movie that was based on this premise. And there was also a lot of nice stylistic choices in the directing, in color filters, in the emphasis of certain sound effects that really indicated to me that likely there's a very skilled director at the helm of this, that even though he has limited resources, is using all of those resources to their greatest potential and really producing something that is a very enjoyable experience for me. So again, that is Parallel. And my number one movie for 2020. I kept this list down to just 5, because even though I could have made a list of 10, and there are definitely some movies that I enjoyed, that I would definitely recommend or watch again from 2020, I decided, no, let's pare it down to 5, so I can really share 5 movies that I really have some enthusiasm about. So anyway, it's not to say that there weren't other really enjoyable movies for me this year, but my number one, I have to give to Love and Monsters. This is a movie that another one that I think all of these you probably missed when they came out in 2020, and maybe not because they're not your kind of thing. If any of these sound interesting to you, I highly recommend checking them out. Love and Monsters. This is I would describe it as a character-driven exploration of the diverse kinds of love that humans can have with other humans, and even with a pet, at least in one case, all in the context of a post-apocalyptic cross-country quest facing off against giant, weird, and diverse creatures and monsters. And you would think that for a movie that is leaning so much on drama and some comedy elements, that they wouldn't feel the need to really go full into the monster side of stuff, the creature effects, the creature designs. But that was easily one of the most striking parts of this movie. Compared to Monster Hunter, which came out in December, this movie had far more monsters and far more interesting monsters than that movie, and really just enjoyed that as a fan of monsters in movies. But on top of that, I get with this movie what I always want so much and so rarely get, and that is wild, geeky genre stuff paired with very relatable human characters and human drama. And a lot of that was really aided by Dylan O'Brien, who is the character that this movie focuses on by far the most, as he's traveling from one part of the country to another to try and reach his girlfriend. And despite that premise, the movie, it does explore all kinds of, it explores parental love, friendship love, the love between a parent and a child, and all kinds of different, community love within a context of community. I mean, it's really just a neat movie that explores love of different types. Dylan O'Brien, who you might know from the Maze Runner movies, he also has this great fish out of water humor in his performance, but that also aids the intensity of when he's on the run from these monsters. He is a character who is, among his group that he starts out with, the least capable in this world full of monsters. And so I'm feeling that tension with him, and it's causing me to laugh. It's causing me to grip the edge of my seat. It's causing me to feel sympathy and compassion for him and all that he's going through. And so I just really appreciated all that he brought that I suspect was not at all on the written page, but it was just layers of subtext that his performance brought that gave richness and relatability to his character. And so, yeah, I really, really enjoyed this movie. Would highly recommend it to anybody that loves monsters and cares about, character-driven stuff and anything that I've said. If it sounds good to you, I highly recommend that you check out my number one movie of 2020, Love and Monsters. And then finally, as tradition has me do every year, I pick out one movie that was my most thought-provoking movie of the year. And this one I am going to cheat, and I am going to bring Color Out of Space into consideration among my 2020 movies for this category, even though normally I wouldn't, especially since it's my legacy movie. But no, I have to give Color Out of Space my most thought-provoking movie credit for the year, because it was just so much more striking and thought-provoking than any of the other movies that I saw that did release technically in 2020. It deals with themes of mortality and fragility, both of yourself and of your loved ones. I mean, Lovecraft, he's dealing with a lot of these themes, but if you really examine them, you realize, this fear of like seeing people's bodies decomposing in horrible, monstrous ways, that's a reflection of our own fear of our mortality and seeing our own bodies waste away when we get to those final years of life, or if we contract a terminal disease or some horribly debilitating disease. These are all just sci-fi exaggerations and parallels to very real-world things that we as humans have to face or watch others face in our lives. And so watching this movie, I won't spoil the movie at all because to get into details of why, but it really led me to face and explore my own fears and anxious feelings about my own mortality and the mortality of my wife, my boys, and the prospect of potentially losing them. And I think that this movie isn't naturally going to help people process that in a healthy way, but when it hit me, the time it hit me, I was able to walk through that experience thinking about that, and joined in that by the Holy Spirit and by Scripture that brought truth to my processing of those thoughts and those feelings in a way that was really, really worthwhile. And so I'm really grateful for this movie, even though I have no reason to think that there were any Christians involved in the production of it. Lovecraft, as far as I know, was certainly not a Christian, but God can use these kinds of things to trigger some worthwhile thought, and that certainly was the case for me in Color Out of Space. So anyway, that's it for my list for this year. I'd love to hear what your favorites are of 2020, either that released in 2020 or that you just discovered while you were holed away in your bunker during 2020. What were some really thought-provoking movies that you experienced during 2020? I'd love to hear about that in the comments below. And then, of course, I would love for you to join us anytime at christiangeekcentral.com as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. The Christian Geek Central podcast is the longest-running podcast for Christian geeks with over 600 weekly episodes and counting, featuring audio versions of much of the same content you'll find here, plus exclusive content including weekly news updates from the creators of Christian comics, novels, and video games, debriefing and commentary about what I've been playing, reading, and watching, and my expanded responses to your comments and questions via YouTube, email, or the Christian Geek Central forums. And now, with timestamps, so you can jump straight to the segments you want to hear most. Get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services, and enjoy one more way you can geek out and seek the truth.